Picture this: a packed chamber in the United States Congress, voices shouting over each other, papers flying, and one lawmaker standing on his desk waving a rubber chicken. No, this isn't a scene from a slapstick comedy. This really happened, and it's just one of the jaw-dropping, head-scratching moments that have unfolded inside the halls of American power. From fistfights to fiery speeches, from scandals that rocked the nation to bizarre antics that left everyone wondering, how did this even happen? Welcome to the untold, unbelievable side of U.S. political history, where the drama isn't scripted and the stakes are anything but low. You might think Congress is all sober debates and polished speeches, but behind those marble columns lies a history packed with chaos, controversy, and downright strangeness. Imagine a senator pulling out a pistol during a heated argument, or a congressman smuggling a live alligator into the Capitol as a protest. These aren't urban legends, they're real events that prove truth is often wilder than fiction. For over 2 centuries, the U.S. Congress has been a stage for some of the most outrageous, shocking, and downright bizarre moments in American history. And today, we're counting down the 30 craziest. This isn't just about laughs or shock value. It's a glimpse into the human side of politics, where tempers flare, egos clash, and sometimes logic takes a backseat. You'll hear about scandals that brought down careers, pranks that went down in legend, and confrontations that could have been ripped from a reality TV show. So whether you're a political junkie or just love a good story, buckle up, because by the time we're done, you'll never look at Congress the same way again. Ready to dive into the madness? Let's go. It was the year 1856, and the United States Senate had become a powder keg of tension over the issue of slavery. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fiery abolitionist, had just delivered a blistering speech condemning pro-slavery lawmakers, including Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Sumner didn't hold back, mocking Butler's speech impediment and accusing him of taking slavery as his mistress. The insults cut deep, but Sumner had no idea his words would provoke one of the most violent acts ever witnessed in Congress. Enter Senator Preston Brooks, Butler's cousin. Outraged by Sumner's remarks, Brooks didn't just want to argue, he wanted revenge. On May 22nd, as Sumner sat at his desk in the Senate chamber, Brooks approached him with a heavy wooden cane, a gutta-percha walking stick, and without warning brought it crashing down on Sumner's head. The first blow was so vicious it shattered the cane, but Brooks kept swinging. Sumner, trapped between his bolted desk and the furious assault, tried to stand but collapsed, blood pouring from his head as he tore the desk from the floor in a desperate attempt to escape. The attack lasted just a minute, but it left Sumner unconscious, his skull fractured, his body mangled. Doctors doubted he would survive, and yet, shockingly, Brooks wasn't arrested on the spot. Instead, Southern lawmakers cheered him as a hero, sending him new canes inscribed with phrases like, "Hit him again." Meanwhile, Sumner became a martyr for the abolitionist cause, his empty Senate seat a haunting symbol of the nation's divide. The assault didn't just break a man, it shattered any illusion that the slavery debate could remain civil. Less than 5 years later, the country would erupt into civil war. And this barbaric moment on the Senate floor, it was one of the first cracks in a crumbling foundation. By the 1950s, America was gripped by fear, not of war or economic collapse, but of an invisible enemy hiding in plain sight. Senator Joseph McCarthy had spent years whipping the nation into a frenzy with his relentless hunt for communists infiltrating the government. His tactics were ruthless, unproven accusations, guilt by association, and public smear campaigns that destroyed careers overnight. But in the spring of 1954, McCarthy finally met his match, not in a shadowy Soviet spy, but in the United States Army. The showdown began when McCarthy turned his attention to the military, claiming communists had wormed their way into its ranks. The Army pushed back hard, accusing McCarthy and his chief aide, Roy Cohn, of bullying their way into preferential treatment for a drafted acquaintance. What followed was 36 days of televised hearings that would change American politics forever. For the first time, millions watched as McCarthy's bombastic style collided with the measured defiance of Army Counsel Joseph Welch. The broadcasts became must-see TV, with families gathering around their living room sets to witness the spectacle. The turning point came on June 9. McCarthy, ever the provocateur, tried to smear one of Welch's young associates as a communist sympathizer. Welch's response was instant and devastating. "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" he demanded, his voice trembling with quiet fury. The chamber fell silent. Even McCarthy's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That moment crystallized what many had suspected. McCarthy wasn't a patriot uncovering threats. He was a bully willing to ruin anyone in his path. Public opinion turned overnight. Newspapers that had once cheered his crusade now condemned him. By December, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to censure McCarthy, stripping him of his power and influence. The man who had once held the country in his grip spent his final years a broken figure, his name synonymous with reckless persecution. The hearings didn't just end a career, they exposed the dangers of unchecked paranoia and proved that even the most feared figures could be held to account. And for television, it marked the birth of a new era, the moment America realized the camera could be as powerful as the gavel. 1973. The White House was under siege, not by foreign adversaries but by its own secrets. What began as a baffling break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 had unraveled into the biggest political scandal in American history, Watergate. But the real fireworks didn't happen in some shadowy backroom. They exploded under the bright lights of the Senate's live televised hearings, where a parade of witnesses laid bare a web of lies, bribes, and illegal cover-ups that reached all the way to the Oval Office. The star of this political theater wasn't a prosecutor or a whistleblower. It was a soft-spoken Republican senator from Tennessee named Howard Baker. As vice chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee, Baker became famous for a single question that cut to the heart of the scandal. What did the president know, and when did he know it? That line wasn't just a soundbite. It was a wrecking ball swinging at the wall of silence protecting Richard Nixon. For weeks, Americans watched transfixed as White House aides, lawyers, and even Nixon's inner circle took the stand, their testimonies peeling back layers of deception. Then came the bombshell. Former White House counsel John Dean, a man who'd once been Nixon's loyal fixer, sat before the committee and delivered 24 hours of jaw-dropping testimony. He described secret slush funds, enemies lists, and a president obsessed with crushing his opponents. But the most chilling moment, Dean's revelation that Nixon had personally approved hush money for the Watergate burglars, and that every conversation about it had been recorded. Those tapes became the smoking gun. The drama reached its peak when Committee Chairman Sam Ervin, a folksy but razor-sharp Democrat from North Carolina, grilled Nixon's aides with biblical fervor. At one point, Ervin held up a copy of the Constitution and thundered, "This is what we're fighting for." The message was clear. No one, not even the president, was above the law. By the time the hearings ended, Nixon's presidency was in freefall. The tapes proved he'd lied. The courts demanded he hand them over, and Congress, Republicans included, moved to impeach him. On August 9, 1974, Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign, but Watergate's legacy wasn't just about one man's downfall. It changed how Americans saw their leaders forever. Suddenly, every politician was under suspicion, every promise met with skepticism. The hearings didn't just expose a crime. They taught the nation an unforgettable lesson. Power unchecked is power corrupted. And sometimes the most shocking truths come to light not in whispers, but under oath with the whole world watching. The tension in the cavernous Senate hearing room was so thick you could almost touch it. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the red-baiting firebrand who'd spent years terrorizing Washington with his communist witch hunts, was about to make a critical miscalculation. It was June 9, 1954, and McCarthy had spent weeks grilling army officials over alleged communist infiltration. But this time, his trademark bullying tactics met an unexpected roadblock: a soft-spoken Boston lawyer named Joseph Welch. Welch, representing the army, had endured days of McCarthy's badgering with quiet patience. But when McCarthy suddenly accused a young associate of Welch's law firm of communist ties, a baseless smear aimed at a low-level staffer uninvolved in the hearings, Welch's demeanor shifted. His voice, usually calm and measured, took on a razor's edge. "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never truly gauged your cruelty or your recklessness," he began. The room hushed as Welch, a man who'd spent his career in courtrooms, delivered a verbal knockout punch. "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even McCarthy's staunchest allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, someone had publicly stripped away the senator's veneer of patriotism to reveal the naked ruthlessness beneath. The moment was electric, not just because of Welch's words, but because the whole exchange was being broadcast live to millions of Americans. Television, still a novelty in politics, became McCarthy's undoing. Viewers who'd only read about his exploits in newspapers now saw the real man, a browbeating provocateur with no regard for fairness or truth. Welch's question didn't just shame McCarthy, it became a cultural turning point. Newspapers that had once treated the senator as a heroic communist hunter now openly criticized him. Public opinion swung violently against him. By year's end, the Senate would censure McCarthy in a landslide vote, effectively ending his reign of political terror. But the legacy of that single question outlasted the man himself. It became shorthand for the moment America confronted its own excesses, a reminder that even in times of fear, decency must prevail. The hearings didn't just mark the fall of McCarthy, they transformed how Americans engaged with politics. For the first time, live TV exposed the raw mechanics of power, proving that sunlight really is the best disinfectant. And Welch's words, they weren't just a rebuke to one man, they were a challenge to every generation. When the line between vigilance and paranoia blurs, someone must stand up and ask, have we no decency? The television cameras clicked on, their harsh lights illuminating the sweating face of the most powerful man in the world. It was November 17, 1973, and President Richard Nixon stood before 400 reporters at Disney World's contemporary resort, an ironic backdrop for a speech that would become one of history's greatest political miscalculations. The Watergate scandal had been chipping away at his presidency for months, but Nixon wasn't coming to apologize. He was coming to fight. For nearly 30 minutes, he paced the stage, jabbing his finger at the air as he dismissed allegations of corruption with mounting frustration. His voice grew hoarse as he insisted no one in his administration was guilty, not of burglary, not of cover-ups, nothing. Then came the moment that would echo through history. "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook," he snapped. "Well, I am not a crook." The room went silent, even his aides froze. That single line, meant to shut down speculation, did the exact opposite. It immortalized Nixon's denial as a symbol of presidential deception. The press pounced immediately. Newspapers plastered the quote across front pages, while late-night comedians turned it into a punchline. But the real damage wasn't the words themselves, it was what they revealed. Nixon's defiance, his refusal to acknowledge the mounting evidence against him, made him look desperate, even guilty. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just weeks earlier, investigators had discovered a secret White House taping system, one that would eventually prove Nixon had orchestrated the Watergate cover-up himself. Historians still debate whether Nixon truly believed his own denials or if he thought he could bluff his way through the crisis. But in that moment, standing before the nation, he misjudged the public's appetite for accountability. People didn't want declarations of innocence, they wanted truth. And as the months passed, with every subpoena ignored, every tape withheld, Nixon's "I am not a crook" line aged like milk in the Florida sun. By resigning less than a year later, he unwittingly turned those 5 words into a cautionary tale. They became a shorthand for political arrogance, a reminder that no amount of bluster can bury the truth forever. And for future leaders, they served as an unheeded warning. When the walls close in, denial isn't a defense, it's an admission. The year was 1858, and America was tearing itself apart over one explosive question: would Kansas enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? The debate had turned the U.S. House of Representatives into a pressure cooker of rage, with northern and southern lawmakers barely containing their hatred for one another. Then, on February 5th, the lid blew off, not with words, but with fists. It started quietly enough. Representative Galusha Grow of Pennsylvania, a staunch abolitionist, was arguing for Kansas's admission as a free state when Mississippi Democrat Lawrence Cate, a man so pro-slavery he'd once nearly caned an abolitionist on the Senate floor, interrupted him with a sneering insult. Grow shot back, calling Cate a dirty liar. That was all it took. Cate lunged across the aisle, grabbing Grow by the throat as desks toppled and inkwells shattered. Within seconds, 50 men were on their feet, some trying to break up the fight, others joining in with wild swings. Wisconsin Republican John Potter, a bear of a man, ripped a fistful of hair from South Carolina's William Boyce's scalp, holding it aloft like a trophy as chaos erupted. The scene was pure pandemonium. Representatives grappled on the floor, their coats ripped, faces bleeding. One congressman brandished a pistol, another swung a heavy brass spittoon. The sergeant-at-arms raced in, waving the house mace, the symbol of order, but even that sacred relic was nearly snatched and used as a club. And all the while, the gallery roared with spectators, some cheering, others screaming in horror as democracy devolved into a barroom brawl. When the dust settled, 30 lawmakers were bruised, battered, or missing chunks of hair. The House adjourned in disgrace, but the real damage wasn't physical. It was the undeniable proof that Congress could no longer debate slavery peacefully. The brawl became a grim omen. Just 3 years later, those same men would take up far deadlier weapons on Civil War battlefields, and the lesson was clear: when words fail, violence follows. The House eventually patched its walls and polished its floors, but the scars of that day lingered, a raw reminder of what happens when a nation stops listening and starts swinging. The halls of Congress still reeked of gunpowder and grief when the first blood-stained shirt made its appearance. The year was 1871, barely 6 years after the Civil War's last shots, and the wounds of the nation were far from healed. Republicans, determined to keep fresh the memory of Union sacrifice, began brandishing gruesome relics on the House floor: actual shirts, uniforms, and bandages soaked with the blood of fallen soldiers. These weren't mere props, they were visceral accusations, each rust-colored stain a silent scream of treason aimed at Democrats who'd once sided with the Confederacy. The most infamous display came from Representative Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, a man nicknamed Beast for his ruthless wartime tactics. One afternoon, he unfurled a shirt caked with the blood of a Union soldier allegedly whipped to death by Confederate sympathizers. Holding it aloft like a battle flag, Butler thundered, "This, gentlemen, is what your peaceful reconciliation looks like." The chamber erupted. Democrats shouted denials while radical Republicans cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of righteous fury. This theatrical shaming wasn't just about the past, it was a political weapon wielded with precision. Every blood-stained shirt served 2 purposes: to paint Democrats as unrepentant rebels and to justify harsh Reconstruction policies in the South. The message was clear: how could anyone trust the party of secession with governing the very country they'd tried to destroy? The tactic worked shockingly well. For over a decade, waving the bloody shirt became shorthand for Republican campaign strategies. turning elections into morality plays where Democrats stood accused of literal treason by association. But the spectacle came at a cost. Each performance deepened the nation's divisions, replacing reconciliation with performative outrage. Southern Democrats, in turn, spun their own narrative, casting themselves as victims of Northern tyranny. The shirts, once symbols of martyrdom, became emblems of an unending cultural war, one where memories of violence were polished like weapons, always ready to be unsheathed. By the 1890s, the practice faded as Reconstruction collapsed and new political battles emerged, yet its legacy endured in the American playbook. The bloody shirt speeches didn't just exploit trauma, they proved that in politics, symbols often cut deeper than facts. And in a country still wrestling with the ghosts of its past, that lesson remains dangerously relevant. The summer heat in Washington, D.C. that year was unbearable, but not half as suffocating as the desperation choking the thousands of World War I veterans camped along the Anacostia River. It was 1932, the nadir of the Great Depression, and these men, many missing limbs, all missing jobs, had come to demand what they'd been promised: cash bonuses for their wartime service, originally scheduled for payout in 1945. With empty pockets and hungry families, they couldn't wait 13 more years. Calling themselves the Bonus Army, they built a shantytown of scrap wood and tar paper within sight of the Capitol Dome, a physical reminder of America's broken promises. Congress wasn't just ignoring them, it was actively hostile. When the House passed a bill to release the bonuses early, the Senate crushed it with a resounding no. The message was clear: these veterans, heroes just a decade earlier, were now seen as beggars and rabble-rousers. But what happened next wasn't just political stonewalling. It became one of the most shameful displays of state violence against citizens in peacetime history. On July 28, under orders from President Herbert Hoover and Attorney General William Mitchell, General Douglas MacArthur assembled 600 armed troops, cavalry with drawn sabers, infantry with fixed bayonets, and 6 tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue. As gas grenades arced through the air, the veterans and their families stumbled blindly through the smoke, children screaming as soldiers torched their makeshift homes. One 12-year-old boy was bayoneted while trying to save his pet rabbit. A veteran's wife miscarried after inhaling tear gas, and when the flames reached the camp's infirmary, medical supplies meant for wounded soldiers burned alongside the last shreds of their dignity. The press captured every horrifying moment. Newspapers splashed photos of mounted troops charging unarmed men across front pages nationwide. Even conservative outlets recoiled. One cartoon showed a veteran skeleton in a tattered uniform, labeled "Died for Democracy, 1932." The political fallout was instant. Hoover, already drowning in blame for the Depression, saw his reputation incinerated alongside the Bonus Army's tents. The brutality didn't just doom his re-election, it reshaped how Americans viewed their government's obligations to its people. Yet the real tragedy wasn't the immediate violence. It was the bitter irony that played out 4 years later when a new Congress finally approved the bonuses in 1936 over Roosevelt's veto. By then, many of the men who'd been gassed and beaten had died in poverty, never seeing the money they'd fought for. Their protest became a grim lesson in political calculus. Sometimes governments only listen when the cameras are rolling and the bayonets are sheathed. June 1971. The air in Washington was thick with deception, 7,000 pages of it. Stuffed into a locked Senate safe lay the Pentagon Papers, a classified government study exposing decades of lies about the Vietnam War. Presidents had lied, generals had lied, and now one freshman senator from Alaska was about to gamble his entire career to force those lies into the light. Mike Gravel wasn't a household name. A former Army counterintelligence officer turned real estate developer. He'd only been in the Senate 2 years, but when Daniel Ellsberg, the military analyst who'd leaked the papers, reached out to him, Gravel didn't hesitate. The documents proved successive administrations had secretly escalated the war while publicly promising peace, a betrayal that had already cost 58,000 American lives. The courts had blocked newspapers from publishing them, citing national security. So Gravel devised an audacious workaround. He'd read them into the congressional record himself. The scene that unfolded could have been lifted from a political thriller. At 1:30 in the morning on June 29th, Gravel convened a secret hearing of his obscure subcommittee on buildings and grounds, the only Senate panel he chaired. No other senators attended, just Gravel, 2 aides, and a stenographer in a tiny, windowless room. For 3 grueling hours, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, he recited damning passages aloud. How Lyndon Johnson had planned bombing campaigns while pledging diplomacy, how the CIA had sabotaged peace talks to help Nixon's election. Every word he spoke became part of the official record, untouchable by court orders. But Gravel wasn't done. Knowing most Americans would never wade through thousands of pages of dry testimony, he partnered with a small publisher to print the papers commercially. When the Justice Department threatened prosecution, he shot back, "I'm willing to go to jail to end this damn war." The Supreme Court eventually ruled in his favor, establishing a landmark precedent: congressional speech isn't just protected, it's sacrosanct. The fallout was seismic. Public trust in government cratered. Nixon, paranoid about leaks, created the White House Plumbers Unit, a decision that would lead straight to Watergate. And Gravel, he became a folk hero to anti-war activists, though his own party shunned him. Years later, he'd reflect that his act wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about proving no government can hide its crimes forever when someone, somewhere, has the courage to say them aloud. The clock had just struck 8:15 on the evening of October 20th, 1973, when the phone rang in Attorney General Elliot Richardson's office. On the line was Alexander Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, delivering an ultimatum from the president: fire Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox immediately. Richardson refused, not just because he respected Cox, but because he'd promised the Senate during his confirmation hearings that the prosecutor would operate with total independence. What followed wasn't just a showdown over legal ethics. It became one of the most dramatic executive power grabs in American history, all unfolding in a single night. Richardson resigned rather than obey the order. Nixon then turned to Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus, who also stood his ground and was fired on the spot. Finally, the president reached Solicitor General Robert Bork, the third in line at the Justice Department. With no precedent to guide him, Bork reluctantly complied, signing Cox's dismissal papers just before midnight. The press dubbed it the Saturday Night Massacre, a chilling purge that saw the nation's top 2 justice officials vanish in hours and its Watergate investigator abruptly unemployed. But Nixon's attempt to shut down the investigation backfired spectacularly. The next morning, newspapers ran banner headlines comparing the White House to a banana republic. Telegrams flooded congressional offices at a rate of 50,000 per hour, 99% demanding impeachment. Even Nixon's staunchest allies panicked. Senator Barry Goldwater reportedly muttered, "We're going to be picking up the pieces of this for years." The real turning point came when Cox's replacement, Leon Jaworski, made a discovery that would seal Nixon's fate: the White House taping system. Those recordings, which Nixon had fought so desperately to hide, proved he'd orchestrated the Watergate cover-up from day one. The Saturday Night Massacre didn't kill the investigation. It exposed Nixon's guilt more starkly than any prosecutor ever could. Within months, the House Judiciary Committee drafted articles of impeachment, forcing Nixon to become the only U.S. president to resign. Looking back, that chaotic night revealed something bigger than one man's corruption. It tested whether America's system of checks and balances could survive a president who treated the law as his personal weapon. Spoiler alert, the system won, but the scars remain, a reminder that no one, not even the commander-in-chief, gets to silence the truth forever. The year was 1980, and the FBI was running an operation so wild it could have been ripped straight from a Hollywood script. Codenamed Abscam, short for Arab scam, the sting was designed to catch corrupt politicians red-handed, but no one expected it to expose just how brazenly some lawmakers were willing to trade their votes for cash. The FBI set up a fake company run by undercover agents posing as wealthy Arab sheikhs, complete with a yacht, limousines, and briefcases stuffed with $100 bills. Their mission: offer bribes to members of Congress and film every damning handshake. One of the most jaw-dropping moments came when Representative Michael Myers of Pennsylvania, a former cop turned congressman, sat down with the sheikhs and uttered a line that would haunt him forever: "I've got larceny in my blood." The video showed him stuffing $50,000 into his jacket pocket without a hint of hesitation, then joking about how easy it was to fool the public. "Money talks in this business," he smirked, unaware the cameras were rolling. But Myers wasn't alone. Over 2 years, the FBI snared 7 members of Congress, along with a handful of local officials, all caught on tape accepting bribes ranging from cash to stock deals in exchange for political favors. Some, like Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, dreamed up elaborate schemes. Williams promised to use his influence to secure mining rights for the fake sheikhs, bragging he could move mountains in Washington. Others, like Representative John Jenrette of South Carolina, took the money with almost casual greed, slipping envelopes into his suit pockets between sips of whiskey. When the scandal finally broke, the fallout was explosive. Newspapers splashed grainy black and white stills from the undercover videos on front pages, showing politicians mid-bribe, their faces frozen in guilty grins. Congress, reeling from the humiliation, expelled Myers, the first such expulsion in over a century. Williams resigned before the Senate could boot him, while 5 others were convicted and sent to prison. Yet Abscam's real legacy wasn't just the convictions. It was the unflinching proof that corruption wasn't some shadowy rumor. It was happening in broad daylight, captured on tape, with lawmakers practically bragging about it. The sting forced Congress to pass new ethics laws, but more importantly, it shattered any remaining illusions about the purity of American politics. Because when the FBI dangled temptation, one thing became painfully clear: for some in power, the only real crime was getting caught. The oak-paneled hearing room of the Senate Judiciary Committee had never seen anything like it. It was October 11, 1991, and a soft-spoken law professor named Anita Hill sat before a row of 14 white men, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the most humiliating experience of her life. Her accusation that Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her when she worked for him a decade earlier was about to detonate a national conversation about power, gender, and who gets believed in America. Hill's testimony was clinical in its detail. She described Thomas's relentless commentary about pornographic films, his graphic descriptions of his own anatomy, even the time he'd looked at a soda can and asked, "Who has put pubic hair on my Coke?" The all-male committee, visibly uncomfortable, kept pressing her. Why hadn't she reported it sooner? Why had she followed Thomas to a new job? Their skepticism dripped from every question, their tone hovering between disbelief and dismissal. At one point, Senator Howell Heflin of Alabama mused aloud whether Hill was suffering from erotomania, a delusion of being loved by powerful men. Then came Clarence Thomas's rebuttal, a performance that would go down in political theater history. Denying every allegation, he framed the hearings as a high-tech lynching, painting himself as the victim of racist stereotypes about black male sexuality. The racial subtext was undeniable, and it worked. Thomas's approval ratings soared among white conservatives, while Hill was caricatured in the press as either a liar or a spurned woman. But what the committee dismissed as a he said, she said squabble ignited a wildfire across the country. Women watched in real time as Hill's credibility was dissected with a scalpel, her every word scrutinized for inconsistencies while Thomas's denials were taken at face value. The hearings became a crash course in workplace dynamics, exposing how rarely women felt safe coming forward and how often they were punished when they did. The aftermath was seismic. The following year, a record number of women ran for office, with female representation in Congress jumping nearly 70%. Companies rushed to implement sexual harassment policies that just months earlier had been laughably rare, and terms like hostile work environment entered the national lexicon. Yet Thomas was confirmed by the narrowest margin in a century, proving how deeply the system was stacked against accusers. Looking back, the hearings weren't just about one man's confirmation. They laid bare whose stories matter in America. Anita Hill wasn't just testifying about Clarence Thomas. She was testifying for every woman who'd ever swallowed her anger to keep her job, every survivor who'd been told she was overreacting. And though the Senate voted to look away, millions of women were finally seeing themselves and deciding enough was enough. The winter of 1995 should have been a season of holiday cheer in Washington. Instead, the nation's capital became a war zone not of bullets but of budget lines and bruised egos. Fresh off a historic Republican takeover of Congress, Speaker Newt Gingrich was riding high, determined to force President Bill Clinton to accept deep spending cuts. What followed wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a full-blown game of chicken that would shut down the federal government not once, but twice, leaving 800,000 workers without paychecks and America's national parks padlocked. The first shutdown began on November 14th, when Clinton vetoed a temporary spending bill packed with GOP demands, everything from slashing Medicare to rolling back environmental regulations. Gingrich, convinced he held the upper hand, refused to back down. Behind closed doors, he reportedly boasted that Republicans could starve the government into submission. But the Speaker underestimated Clinton's political instincts. While Gingrich cast the fight as fiscal responsibility, Clinton framed it as an assault on working families. The optics turned brutal when veterans' benefit checks were delayed and Washington's monuments went dark. Tourists arriving at the Lincoln Memorial found chains across the steps, their vacations ruined by partisan gridlock. Then came Gingrich's fatal miscalculation. At a breakfast with reporters, he complained that Clinton had snubbed him on Air Force One, making him exit from the rear of the plane. "It's petty," Gingrich grumbled, but the damage was done. Newspapers cartooned him as a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum while furloughed workers struggled to pay rent. Public opinion swung hard against the GOP. By the time the first shutdown ended after 5 days, Clinton emerged stronger, but Gingrich wasn't done. Round 2 began in mid-December and lasted a grueling 21 days, the longest in U.S. history. This time, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Scientists at the Centers for Disease Control were ordered to stop tracking flu outbreaks. Cleanup of toxic waste sites halted. Even the National Zoo's beloved panda cam went offline, sparking nationwide outrage. Yet Gingrich kept doubling down, telling his caucus, "We're not bluffing." Clinton, sensing victory, went on TV flanked by furloughed workers, hammering home one message: this is not about budgets, it's about bullying. The final blow came when internal GOP polls showed voters blaming Republicans 2-1. On January 6, 1996, Gingrich's troops surrendered, passing a spending bill with none of their demands. The shutdowns had cost the economy over $2 billion and cost Republicans their aura of invincibility. Clinton, once written off as a lame duck, sailed to re-election 11 months later, but the real legacy was darker. Gingrich had proven that shutting down the government could be a political weapon, a precedent that would haunt Congress for decades. Because when the gates of national parks close and paychecks stop, nobody wins except maybe the cynics who realize how easily democracy can be held hostage. It was a scandal that blurred the line between politics and tabloid fodder, where sex, power, and perjury collided in a spectacle that held the nation captive. 1998 began with President Bill Clinton under oath, emphatically denying a single question. Did you have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky? His finger-wagging declaration would haunt him because by summer, the truth came out in the most lurid way possible. The evidence wasn't just testimony or grainy photos. It was a navy blue dress from the Gap, stained with DNA that matched the president's. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern, had confided in co-worker Linda Tripp, who secretly recorded their conversations. Those tapes landed in the hands of independent counsel Kenneth Starr, a man whose investigation into a decades-old Arkansas real estate deal had somehow spiraled into a probe of Clinton's sex life. Starr's 445-page report read like a cheap novel, detailing clandestine Oval Office encounters and cigar-related euphemisms that turned congressional hearings into a national cringe fest. Republicans, led by firebrand House Manager Henry Hyde, seized the moment. To them, this wasn't about sex, it was about perjury and obstruction. Clinton had lied under oath about the affair during a sexual harassment lawsuit filed by Paula Jones, then allegedly urged Lewinsky to hide gifts they'd exchanged. Hyde framed impeachment as a moral imperative, thundering, "If you can't believe the president, who can you believe?" But Democrats saw a partisan witch hunt. They pointed out Starr had spent $70 million investigating Clinton, more than the cost of the Watergate probe, only to uncover an affair, not high crimes. The public agreed. Polls showed most Americans, while disapproving of Clinton's behavior, opposed removal. Comedians had a field day. Late-night hosts joked about the nation's adolescent obsession with the president's private life. The climax came in December when the House voted almost strictly along party lines to impeach Clinton for perjury and obstruction. Only the second president in history to face such a verdict. The Senate trial, however, was anticlimactic. With no hope of reaching the two-thirds majority needed for conviction, Republicans mostly went through the motions. Clinton, ever the political survivor, emerged with his approval ratings intact while his accusers faced backlash for overreach. The real casualty wasn't Clinton's presidency, it was America's faith in the impartiality of justice. The saga exposed how easily legal machinery could be weaponized for political vendettas, a lesson that would echo in future impeachment battles. And for Monica Lewinsky, she became the first victim of the internet's ruthless scorn, a cautionary tale about how power imbalances play out not in courtrooms but in headlines. The blue dress may have proved Clinton lied, but the spectacle proved something darker. In Washington, humiliation is always bipartisan. The chamber of the House of Representatives had seen plenty of heated moments, but nothing quite like this. It was September 9, 2009, and President Barack Obama stood at the podium delivering a prime-time address on his signature health care bill. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The Affordable Care Act was already dividing the nation, with Republicans branding it as government overreach. But no one expected the night to descend into chaos with just two explosive words. As Obama assured Congress that his plan wouldn't cover undocumented immigrants, a voice rang out from the Republican side of the aisle. "You lie." The shout came from Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, his face flushed with defiance. The room froze, gasps echoed under the dome. For decades, presidential addresses to Congress had been governed by unspoken rules of decorum: no interruptions, no jeering, certainly no outright accusations of dishonesty aimed at the commander-in-chief. Wilson had just shattered that tradition in front of 40 million television viewers. Obama, momentarily thrown off, paused before replying with a dry, "That's not true," then continued his speech. But the damage was done. Democrats erupted in outrage, some shouting at Wilson to apologize. The outburst wasn't just rude, it was a stark symbol of how deeply partisan rancor had eroded basic civility in Washington. The fallout was swift. Wilson became an overnight villain for liberals and a folk hero for conservatives who saw his outburst as righteous defiance. Within hours, his campaign website crashed under a flood of donations, both supporting and condemning him. The House formally rebuked Wilson with a rare bipartisan resolution, though Republicans mostly voted against it, wary of alienating their base. Wilson himself later apologized to the White House, calling his words inappropriate, but the moment had already seared itself into political memory. What made "You Lie" so seismic wasn't just the breach of protocol. It was the unmasking of a new era in American politics, one where performative outrage often overshadowed policy debate. Social media amplified the moment instantly, turning Wilson into a hashtag and cementing the idea that disruption equaled strength. In the years that followed, similar outbursts would become almost routine, heckling at State of the Union addresses, mic drop moments in hearings, but Wilson's shout was the crack in the dam. Looking back, that night didn't just change how presidents addressed Congress. It revealed how thin the veneer of political decorum had become, and how easily it could be torn away by someone willing to yell loud enough. The morning of January 8, 2011 began like any other Saturday in Tucson, Arizona. Sunny, quiet, ordinary. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords had set up a casual meet and greet outside a local supermarket, her Congress on Your Corner event designed to bring government closer to the people she served. But in a split second, the ordinary shattered. A gunman opened fire, unloading 33 rounds into the crowd. 6 people died, including a federal judge and a 9-year-old girl born on September 11, 2001, a child whose life had literally bookended America's post-9/11 era. Giffords herself took a bullet through the brain, her survival uncertain as she was rushed into surgery. The attack wasn't just a random act of violence, it struck at the heart of democracy itself. Giffords, a moderate Democrat known for crossing the aisle, had been listed on Sarah Palin's infamous crosshairs map during the 2010 midterms, a graphic that marked 20 Democratic seats with rifle sights. While the shooter's motives were murky, the timing was impossible to ignore. The political climate had grown increasingly volatile, with Tea Party rallies featuring effigies of lawmakers in nooses and protesters shouting Second Amendment remedies at town halls. Suddenly, the metaphorical targeting of opponents didn't feel so metaphorical anymore. What happened next was unexpected, a collective pause. For weeks, the usual partisan sniping stopped cold. President Obama flew to Tucson for a memorial service that felt more like a national therapy session, his speech urging Americans to talk in a way that heals, not wounds. Even Giffords' fiercest opponents, like Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, spoke of her with uncharacteristic warmth. The House postponed all legislative business, and when they reconvened, Democrats and Republicans sat side by side, not separated by party lines for the first time in memory. But the ceasefire didn't last. Within months, the old rhetoric crept back in. The debate over debt ceilings and Obamacare reignited with familiar venom, proving how hard it was to sustain unity in an era of hyper-partisanship. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Giffords, against all odds, survived. Her agonizing recovery, learning to walk again, to speak again, became a living rebuke to the idea that politics was just a game. When she resigned from Congress a year later to focus on her health, the chamber gave her a standing ovation that transcended party. And though she could barely form sentences, her final words to her colleagues rang clear: fight, fight, fight. The tragedy forced a reckoning America still hasn't fully resolved. It revealed how easily political speech could blur into incitement, how quickly heated rhetoric could spill into real-world violence. But it also showed the resilience of democracy, not as an abstract ideal, but as something fragile, human, and worth protecting. Because when a congresswoman can be gunned down at a grocery store and still have the courage to come back and demand better, that's not just a story about politics, it's a story about the people who refuse to let hate have the last word. The midnight oil burned in the Senate chamber on September 24, 2013, But this wasn't a debate about national security or economic policy. Instead, the air was thick with the rhythmic cadence of children's literature as Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, clutching a well-worn copy of Green Eggs and Ham, launched into what would become one of the most surreal political spectacles in modern memory. His target, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, and his weapon of choice was a filibuster laced with Dr. Seuss. Cruz's marathon speech clocking in at 21 hours and 19 minutes was technically a faux filibuster. Unlike traditional filibusters that block votes by endless talking, this one was symbolic, a last-ditch protest before a key procedural vote on funding the healthcare law. But symbolism didn't stop Cruz from turning the Senate floor into a mix of conservative manifesto and story hour. He recited Green Eggs and Ham in its entirety, dedicating it to his daughters back in Texas. He mused about the White House's bread lines and rationing under Obamacare. At one point, he even veered into a bizarre critique of Star Wars, comparing the Rebel Alliance's fight against the Empire to his own crusade against the healthcare law. Theatrics aside, the stunt exposed the deepening polarization in Congress. Critics, including fellow Republicans, dismissed it as a self-serving publicity grab. Senator John McCain later quipped, "I don't know what that achieved." Even Cruz's reading choice backfired fans of Dr. Seuss pointed out the book's message about keeping an open mind. Try them. Try them and you may, clashed spectacularly with his refusal to compromise. Yet the spectacle resonated online, where clips of Cruz dramatically flipping through the colorful pages went viral. Supporters hailed him as a modern-day Mr. Smith standing against Washington's machine. Opponents mocked the performance as proof politics had jumped the shark. Either way, Cruz's gambit didn't stop Obamacare. The funding vote passed the next day. But it did cement a new era of political theater, where viral moments often mattered more than legislative results. Because when history looks back on this chapter, one thing's certain: no one expected a battle over healthcare to include a cameo from Sam I Am. The United States Senate's website was supposed to be a fortress of bureaucratic stability until one morning in June 2013. When visitors expecting dry legislative updates got the internet's most infamous prank instead. Without warning, the official Senate.gov domain suddenly redirected to a grainy YouTube clip of Rick Astley's 1987 hit "Never Gonna Give You Up," plunging the staid institution headfirst into the chaotic world of rickrolling. This wasn't just a mischievous hack. The breach exposed a startling vulnerability in the federal government's digital infrastructure. The hacker, identifying himself as TMP0ISON in a gloating tweet, had exploited a weak point in third-party vendor software used by the Senate. In seconds, he replaced pages tracking national security bills with Astley's pixelated grin and that unmistakable synth riff. Capitol IT teams scrambled to take the site offline, but not before the internet seized on the absurdity. Twitter erupted with jokes about bipartisan bops and senators being rickrolled into transparency. Behind the laughs, though, lay a serious wake-up call. Cybersecurity experts pointed out the breach could have been far worse. Instead of an 80s pop anthem, the hacker might have planted malware or stolen sensitive data. The Senate site had no direct access to classified information, but the symbolism stung. If a lone prankster could waltz in undetected, what could state-sponsored hackers do? The aftermath was a mix of embarrassment and action. The Senate Sergeant-at-Arms launched a full investigation, quietly upgrading firewalls and patching vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the hacker, later revealed to be a British teenager, was arrested but faced minimal consequences. His stunt treated more like digital graffiti than a national security threat. Yet the incident left its mark. It proved no institution, no matter how powerful, was immune to internet culture's disruptive whims. And for cybersecurity professionals, it became a go-to cautionary tale. sometimes the biggest threats aren't shadowy foreign operatives, but bored kids with a knack for code and a flair for the absurd. Because when the US Senate gets rickrolled on live TV, it's hard to argue the digital age plays by anyone's rules. The chamber of the United States Senate was electric with tension in the early hours of July 28, 2017. After months of secret backroom deals and furious lobbying, the Republican Party stood on the verge of fulfilling its 7-year promise, repealing the Affordable Care Act. Vice President Mike Pence hovered near the podium, ready to cast the tie-breaking vote. The bill's passage seemed inevitable until an 80-year-old man with a brain tumor and a lifetime of defiance slowly rose from his desk. John McCain had flown straight to Washington from his Arizona hospital bed just days after his devastating cancer diagnosis. The maverick senator, still recovering from surgery, wore a visible scar above his left eye as he strode onto the Senate floor. His own party leaders had pressured him relentlessly, but McCain had spent decades building a reputation for putting country over party. As the clerk called his name, the room fell silent. Then, with dramatic flourish, he lifted his arm and turned his thumb down. The gasp from Republicans was audible. McCain hadn't just voted no, he delivered a theatrical rebuke to President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's rushed backdoor repeal effort. His thumbs down gesture echoed ancient Roman gladiatorial contests where emperors decided a fighter's fate. Only this time, McCain was sparing the health care of millions. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Republican staffers stood frozen in shock as Democrats erupted in applause. McCain, ever the showman, sauntered across the aisle to hug his longtime friend Senator Joe Manchin, as if to underline his point: some principles dwarf partisan loyalty. The bill failed by a single vote, 49-51, a margin made possible solely by McCain's last-minute defiance. But this wasn't just political theater. In the days leading up to the vote, McCain had openly criticized the secretive process, famously urging his colleagues to return to regular order with committee hearings and bipartisan input. His vote wasn't just about preserving Obamacare. It was a protest against the erosion of Senate norms, a fiery parting shot from a man who'd spent 30 years watching the institution he loved descend into hyper-partisan warfare. The moment crystallized McCain's complex legacy. To conservatives, he was a traitor who betrayed his party at a pivotal moment. To moderates, he was a hero who'd saved health care for 23 million Americans. But beyond policy, that thumb flick became a symbol of something vanishingly rare in modern politics: a politician willing to torch his own career for what he believed was right. 5 years later, with the Affordable Care Act still standing and McCain gone, that single vote lingers as a masterclass in political courage. Because when history called, McCain answered, not as a Republican, but as a senator who still believed some fights were bigger than team sports. And in doing so, he gave Washington something it desperately needed: a reminder that conscience still has a place in politics, even if only for a moment. The air in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was thick with history and something far heavier. On September 27, 2018, 3 decades after Anita Hill's seismic testimony, another woman sat before a panel of senators, her voice trembling not with anger, but with something more devastating: certainty. Christine Blasey Ford, a California psychology professor, had come to describe what she called her 100% recollection of being sexually assaulted by Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh when they were teenagers. Her testimony wasn't just about memory, it was about the visceral, physical details that trauma etches into the body forever: the narrow twin bed, the hand over her mouth. The laughter Kavanaugh's and his friend Mark Judge's as she feared she might suffocate. Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, she said quietly, invoking the brain's memory center with clinical precision. Then came Kavanaugh's turn. The Yale-educated judge, known for his judicial restraint, erupted like a man wronged. Red-faced and pounding the table, he framed the allegations as a calculated and orchestrated political hit, his voice cracking with what sounded like rage or grief, or both. He invoked his daughter's prayers, his father's calendars, even his high school yearbook to prove his innocence. At one point, he turned the tables on Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, snarling, "You're asking about blackout drinking. What about you?" Before later apologizing to supporters, his fury read as righteous indignation. To critics, it was the unmasking of privileged entitlement. But beneath the theatrics, the hearings exposed America's rawest nerves. Ford's quiet dignity versus Kavanaugh's explosive defiance became a Rorschach test for how the nation viewed power, memory, and accountability. Social media erupted with hashtags like #WhyIDidn'tReport and #BelieveSurvivors, while conservative commentators framed Kavanaugh as the latest victim of guilty until proven innocent mob justice. The committee's handling of the allegations, especially the decision not to call additional witnesses Ford had named, left many feeling the process was rigged from the start. When the Senate confirmed Kavanaugh days later by the narrowest margin in modern Supreme Court history, the scars remained. For millions of women, Ford's testimony validated their own silenced stories. For Kavanaugh's backers, his confirmation became a rallying cry against what they saw as weaponized victimhood, and for the court itself, the stain of controversy never fully faded. Because long after the shouting faded, one question lingered: when institutions weigh credibility, whose pain counts more, the accusers or the accused? The answer, it turned out, depended entirely on who you asked. It was supposed to be an evening of pomp and protocol, the annual State of the Union address, where presidents tout their achievements and lawmakers dutifully applaud regardless of party. But February 4, 2020 was different. From the moment President Trump entered the House chamber, the air crackled with unspoken tension. He'd refused to shake Speaker Nancy Pelosi's outstretched hand, a breach of tradition caught on camera, before launching into a speech that framed his impeachment as a vicious witch hunt. Democrats sat in stony silence while Republicans chanted, "4 more years." Then came the moment America couldn't stop talking about: Pelosi's clap. Not just any clap, a slow, deliberate, almost theatrical gesture, her hands moving with the precision of a conductor mocking a bad performance. As Trump claimed credit for record-low unemployment, Pelosi's exaggerated applause, paired with a tight-lipped smile, became an instant meme. Social media exploded with GIFs of the moment, zooming in on her raised eyebrows and the way her palms barely touched, as if afraid even sarcasm might contaminate her. To some, it was the epitome of petty politics. To others, a masterclass in silent defiance. The symbolism cut deep. Here was the first female Speaker of the House, fresh from leading Trump's impeachment, weaponizing the politest form of dissent available to her. No shouting, no gavel strikes, just a gesture so refined it scalded. Historians trace the clap's lineage to Victorian-era slow hand claps, used to shame poor performers, while late-night hosts dubbed it the clap of doom. But Pelosi's real genius was in the aftermath. Asked by reporters if the clap was disrespectful, she deadpanned, "That was generous." Behind the meme lay a stark power dynamic. Trump's speech had been a victory lap, but Pelosi's reaction, and her later, very public tearing up of his speech behind his back, framed the night as something else entirely, a visual manifesto of resistance. In an era where politics often played out in viral snippets, her clap became the perfect metaphor for democratic strategy, fighting noise with quiet, calculated precision. And as the clip racked up millions of views, one thing became clear: sometimes the loudest statements come without saying a word. January 6, 2021 began as a day of ceremony. Congress was set to certify Joe Biden's electoral victory, the final step in a months-long election process. But by mid-afternoon, the halls of the U.S. Capitol echoed with something far darker: the thunder of battering rams, the shriek of shattered glass, and the chants of a mob storming the building. What unfolded wasn't just a protest gone wrong. It was the first violent breach of the Capitol since 1814, an attack broadcast live to a horrified nation watching democracy under siege. The rioters, many clad in tactical gear and waving Trump flags, overpowered police barricades within minutes, crawling up scaffolding, smashing windows with flagpoles and stolen riot shields. They poured into the building like a flood, some hunting for lawmakers, others posing for selfies in the very chambers where laws are made. Inside, staffers and politicians scrambled to safety, barricading doors with furniture and evacuating through hidden tunnels. One chilling video showed Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman single-handedly luring rioters away from the Senate chamber, buying precious seconds for senators to escape. Another captured Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican, pleading with his colleagues to call Trump and tell him to pull his people back, a stark admission of where the mob's fury originated. The most harrowing moments played out in real time. Lawmakers crouched under desks in the House gallery, donning gas masks as tear gas seeped into the chamber. Staffers piled documents and laptops into bins, rushing to protect sensitive materials. Outside, gallows were erected on the Capitol lawn, nooses swaying in the winter wind as the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," their rage turning on the vice president for refusing to overturn the election. The violence wasn't random, it was targeted, fueled by weeks of false claims about a stolen election, and culminating in a coordinated assault on the heart of American government. When the dust settled, 5 people were dead, including a Capitol Police officer beaten with a fire extinguisher. The symbolism was inescapable. Confederate flags carried through the halls for the first time since the Civil War. Smears of blood on statues of presidents, a noose meant for the vice president. The attack wasn't just an insult to democracy, it was a confession. For years, extremists had been told the system was rigged. On January 6th, they took that rhetoric literally, turning the Capitol into a battleground. In the days that followed, the world watched as National Guard troops patrolled the same corridors where tourists once wandered. Broken glass was swept up, bullet holes patched, but the scars remained not just on the building, but on the nation's psyche, because the riot didn't just expose the fragility of democracy. It proved how easily lies, weaponized by those in power, can turn into violence. And for lawmakers who survived the siege, huddled in lockdown as their offices were ransacked, the lesson was clear. The greatest threat to American democracy wasn't a foreign army. It was the enemy within. Few figures in modern congressional history have courted controversy quite like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Elected to Congress in 2021, the Georgia Republican quickly made headlines not for legislative accomplishments, but for embracing conspiracy theories so outlandish they seemed ripped from internet message boards. Before even taking office, old social media posts surfaced showing Greene endorsing the baseless QAnon conspiracy, suggesting the Parkland school shooting was staged, and alleging the California wildfires were caused by, wait for it, a Jewish space laser. The space laser claim, pulled from a 2018 Facebook post, claimed billionaire Rothschild family members used orbital energy weapons to start forest fires. Experts immediately debunked the anti-Semitic trope, but Greene doubled down, weaving it into speeches about globalist elites. The absurdity masked something darker, a pattern of rhetoric targeting marginalized groups while amplifying extremist ideologies. Then came the harassment of Parkland survivors. In unearthed videos, Greene pursued David Hogg, a student activist whose classmates were murdered in the 2018 massacre, calling him a coward on Capitol Hill. She'd previously liked social media posts calling for Hogg's execution. When confronted, Greene dismissed the backlash as cancel culture, framing herself as a truth-teller silenced by the establishment. But the controversies didn't stop at rhetoric. Greene was removed from House committees for endorsing violence against Democrats, including old posts about bullet to the head, threats against Speaker Pelosi. Colleagues described her as a disruptive force, one moment heckling Biden during a State of the Union, the next handing out Trump won signs during the January 6th certification. What makes Greene's rise remarkable isn't just the extremism, but the GOP's muted response. Instead of marginalizing her, party leadership largely stood by, calculating her loyalty to Trump outweighed the damage. The strategy worked in the short term. Greene became a fundraising powerhouse, but at what cost? Her trajectory raises uncomfortable questions about what's now considered acceptable in politics. Because when space lasers and school shooting denialism earn cheers rather than censure, it's not just one politician's credibility at stake, it's democracy's immunity to disinformation. And that's a conspiracy worth investigating. It started as a drunken NASCAR chant and became a political battle cry, proof that in the digital age, memes move faster than legislation. October 2021, at a race in Alabama, a reporter interviewed driver Brandon Brown after his victory, but the crowd's boisterous chanting drowned her out. "Sounds like they're saying, 'Let's go, Brandon,'" she offered cheerfully, oblivious to the real phrase roaring through the stands. "F Joe Biden." The clip went viral overnight, morphing into a coded conservative rallying cry. Within weeks, "Let's go Brandon" wasn't just a meme, it was echoing through the halls of Congress. Republican lawmakers, always quick to harness pop culture for political points, seized the phrase with gusto. Representative Bill Pelosi of Florida ended a speech on the House floor with a grinning, "Let's go Brandon," officially baptizing the slang into the congressional record. Others followed suit, tweeting it, printing it on merch, even projecting it onto buildings. The chant's genius lay in its plausible deniability. Critics couldn't accuse them of outright vulgarity, but everyone knew the subtext. It was politics as internet trolling, a wink to the base wrapped in juvenile humor. Critics dismissed it as childish, but the phenomenon revealed something deeper. This wasn't just about mocking Biden, it was a testament to how online culture now drives real-world political expression. The speed at which a niche sports moment became a national slogan showed how social media flattens hierarchies. A joke born in a beer-soaked grandstand could now shape discourse in the nation's most august chambers. No press release required. Democrats fumbled the response. Some overcorrected, like when the White House tweeted a clip of Biden saying, "Brandon, I've got your back," missing the joke entirely. Others, like Representative Eric Swalwell, tried to reclaim it with merch of their own, printing, "Let's go Brandon" alongside, to prison for the January 6th insurrection. The backlash was swift, proving how poorly insider politics translates to meme warfare. What made "Let's go Brandon" stick wasn't just its anti-Biden sentiment. It was the perfect storm of irony, rebellion, and shared cultural shorthand, something traditional attack ads could never replicate. By the time late-night hosts parodied it and universities added it to linguistic studies, the chant had already cemented its place in the annals of political absurdity. Because when Congress starts borrowing jokes from frat boys and forum trolls, it's clear the internet isn't just influencing politics anymore, it's running the show. The spotlight burned hot on the Senate floor in March 2021 as Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, clad in a bright pink coat and a defiant smirk, delivered a moment that would come to define her political identity. The issue at hand was a $15 minimum wage hike, a key progressive priority tucked into President Biden's pandemic relief bill. For weeks, activists had pressured Democrats to pass it through budget reconciliation, a procedural workaround to avoid Republican obstruction. The vote was razor close, hanging on every Democratic senator's support. Then, as the clerk called her name, Sinema swept into the aisle, executed an exaggerated curtsy, and thrust her thumb downward with the flourish of a Roman emperor condemning a gladiator. The chamber erupted. Progressives were livid. Here was a Democrat elected with grassroots backing, openly sabotaging a policy that would lift millions of working Americans out of poverty. Social media exploded with clips of the gesture, set to sarcastic soundtracks and spliced with footage of struggling fast food workers. What made the thumbs down sting wasn't just the vote itself, it was the performative glee with which Sumner delivered it. While colleagues like Joe Manchin opposed the wage hike quietly, Sumner turned dissent into spectacle. Her curtsy, paired with that smug grin, felt like a slap to the very voters who'd propelled her from Green Party activist to Senate rising star. Behind the theatrics lay a calculated gambit. Sumner had spent years cultivating an image as a maverick, cozying up to corporate donors while shrugging off party loyalty. The minimum wage vote wasn't just a policy stance, it was a branding exercise. By flaunting her opposition, she signaled to deep-pocketed interests that she couldn't be bullied by the left. The move paid off in the short term. Lobbyists praised her courage, and centrist pundits crowned her a rare bipartisan dealmaker. But back home in Arizona, where the cost of rent soared and service workers struggled to afford groceries, the backlash was swift and merciless. Protesters trailed Sumner everywhere into elevators, restaurants, even a college bathroom where she'd locked herself to avoid confrontation. They waved signs reading "Thumbs down to hunger" and chanted slogans outside her office. The fury wasn't just about wages, it was about betrayal. Sumner had run as a progressive champion, promising to fight for working families. Now she was curtsying for the cameras while blocking their rays. The fallout reshaped Arizona politics. Former allies endorsed primary challengers. The state Democratic Party censured her. Even the White House, wary of alienating moderates, offered only tepid criticism. But the real lesson of Sumner's thumbs down wasn't about one senator's rebellion. It was about the widening chasm between Democratic leadership and its base. Because when a party's own lawmakers treat economic justice as a punchline, it's not just a policy defeat. It's a warning sign that the people who need help most are being left behind, not by the opposition, but by those who claim to represent them. The story of George Santos reads like a poorly written political thriller, except every unbelievable twist turned out to be true. When the freshman Republican from New York arrived in Congress in January 2023, he introduced himself as the proud son of Brazilian immigrants, a Baruch College graduate with a finance degree, a former star volleyball player, and a man who lost 4 employees in the September 11th attacks. There was just one problem: none of it was real. Reporters at the New York Times began picking apart Santos's biography like a cheap wig. His claimed alma mater, Baruch College, had no record of him. The investment firm he said employed him, Goldman Sachs, flatly denied it. His supposed volleyball career, a complete fabrication. Even his tearful story about losing colleagues on 9/11 collapsed under scrutiny. No records connected him to the tragedy. The lies weren't just exaggerations, they formed the entire foundation of his campaign. Santos hadn't polished his resume, he'd fictionalized it from scratch. But the fraud didn't stop at tall tales. Federal investigators soon uncovered a trail of financial deception that made his fake degrees look tame. Santos allegedly misused campaign funds for Botox treatments, luxury designer purchases, and payments to OnlyFans creators. He claimed to have loaned his campaign $700,000, but prosecutors alleged the money came from undisclosed sources, possibly even illicit ones. Even his personal life became a hall of mirrors, with questions swirling about a husband who may not exist and a past as a drag queen in Brazil he alternately embraced and denied. The fallout was swift and brutal. Fellow Republicans, already wary of his flamboyant persona, distanced themselves faster than a sinking ship. Democrats seized on the scandal as a symbol of GOP dysfunction. Late-night hosts had a field day, dubbing Santos the Pocahontas of Congress. Yet despite the avalanche of disgrace, Santos clung to his seat for months, voting on critical legislation while under multiple investigations. What made the Santos saga more than just political schadenfreude was what it revealed about modern politics. In an era where viral fundraising and personality-driven campaigns dominate, Santos proved how easily a charismatic con artist could game the system, at least until the truth caught up. His district had been desperate for representation after a close election, and Santos sold them a fantasy. By the time voters realized they'd been duped, it was too late. The final irony: Santos's greatest political achievement may have been unintentionally revitalizing interest in local journalism. Without dogged reporters fact-checking his ever-shifting stories, he might still be sitting in Congress today, spinning new tales between votes. Instead, he became a cautionary footnote, proof that in democracy, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we see coming, but the ones we elect. For 9 straight months, the United States military found itself in uncharted territory, not on a battlefield, but in the halls of Congress, where one senator brought the Pentagon's leadership pipeline to a grinding halt. The year was 2023, and Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville, a former college football coach turned politician, had decided to wage a one-man war over a Defense Department policy allowing service members to travel for abortions if stationed in states that ban the procedure. His weapon of choice, an obscure Senate rule that let him single-handedly freeze the promotions of over 300 senior military officers, from generals to admirals, in what became the longest hold on military nominations in American history. At first, Tuberville's blockade seemed like political theater, a symbolic protest against what he called the Biden administration's backdoor abortion funding. But as weeks turned into months, the ripple effects turned catastrophic. Key positions across every branch of the armed forces sat empty or were filled by exhausted leaders pulling double duty. The Marine Corps went without a confirmed commandant for the first time in over a century. Strategic posts overseeing nuclear weapons, cybersecurity, and NATO readiness languished in bureaucratic limbo. Even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military's highest-ranking officer, faced the unprecedented scenario of retiring without a confirmed successor. Behind the scenes, the strain became unbearable. Acting officials lacked the full authority to make critical decisions, creating bottlenecks in everything from weapons procurement to troop deployments. Families of high-ranking officers were trapped in limbo too, unable to sell homes or enroll children in new schools as promotions stalled. Pentagon leaders, normally careful to avoid political fights, went public with rare fury. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warned the hold was a gift to China and Russia, while Navy Admiral Mike Mullen, a former Joint Chiefs chair, called it destructive nonsense. What made Tuberville stand so contentious wasn't just the policy dispute, it was the collateral damage. Military leaders pointed out these weren't political appointees but career officers who'd spent decades serving under both parties. Holding their promotions hostage over an unrelated culture war issue shattered norms of civilian-military relations. Even fellow Republicans grew uneasy. Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve, blasted the tactic as dangerous during a late-night floor speech, his voice shaking with emotion. The standoff finally ended in December, not with a victory but a partial retreat. Under mounting pressure, Tuberville lifted most of his holds, though only after forcing individual votes on some nominees, a tedious process that wasted hours of Senate time. In the end, no policy changed. The abortion travel rules remained intact, but the lasting harm was undeniable. A demoralized officer corps, a precedent for hijacking military readiness as bargaining chips, and a glaring lesson in how one stubborn senator could exploit Senate rules to hold national security hostage. Because when political grudges collide with the needs of those who defend the country, the casualties aren't just bureaucratic, they're a warning sign of a system teetering toward dysfunction. The hearing room should have been focused on national security instead. All eyes were locked on 90-year-old Senator Dianne Feinstein as she struggled to recall basic details about the bill she was meant to be discussing. It was February 2023, and the California Democrat, once a towering figure in judiciary and intelligence matters, now sat hunched in her chair, her voice faltering as she asked a witness to repeat a question she'd already been answered twice. "Could you reintroduce yourself?" she murmured, blinking in confusion as staffers leaned in to whisper prompts. The clip went viral within hours, sparking a painful but necessary national conversation. When does aging in office cross from experience into incapacity? Feinstein's lapses weren't isolated. Months earlier, she'd returned to Washington after a prolonged absence due to shingles, only to confess she hadn't read a key piece of legislation she'd later voted on. Reporters noted her tendency to repeat questions in back-to-back meetings, sometimes within minutes. Colleagues described her relying on aides to guide her through hallways she'd walked for 30 years. Yet what made the situation so fraught wasn't just the visible decline. It was the political paralysis surrounding it. Feinstein refused calls to resign, while Democratic leaders, wary of losing a reliable vote in a narrowly divided Senate, tiptoed around the issue with vague statements about respecting her legacy. Behind the scenes, the toll became undeniable. Critical judicial confirmations stalled when Feinstein's absence left the Judiciary Committee deadlocked. Staffers privately admitted drafting statements and votes for her signature with little input. Even basic constituent meetings were reportedly handled by aides, raising ethical questions about who was truly representing California. The spectacle laid bare a systemic flaw. Unlike the presidency, Congress has no mechanism to assess cognitive fitness. Supreme Court justices serve for life without oversight. Senators can remain in office as long as voters re-elect them, even if they can no longer recognize the colleagues sitting beside them. The debate split along generational lines. Younger progressives pointed to Feinstein as proof of America's gerontocracy, where the average senator was 65 and leaders clung to power well into their 80s. Defenders countered that age brought wisdom, noting Feinstein's historic accomplishments, from the assault weapons ban to her pivotal role in the post-9/11 intelligence reforms. But the elephant in the room couldn't be ignored. If a corporate CEO or airline pilot exhibited similar confusion, they'd be swiftly removed. Yet in Congress, the only term limits were death or defeat at the polls. Feinstein's eventual passing in September 2023 ended the controversy but not the conversation. Her final year had become a cautionary tale about power's reluctance to relinquish itself and the costs of a system that prioritizes seniority over vitality. Because when democracy's stewards can't remember the debates they're deciding, the real question isn't about one senator's legacy. It's about whether institutions designed in the 1700s can function when those at the helm outlive their capacity to lead. The gavel came down on October 3, 2023, marking the end of an era and the beginning of political chaos. Kevin McCarthy had battled for 15 rounds of voting just to become Speaker of the House 9 months earlier, making concessions to far-right rebels that would ultimately seal his fate. But no one expected his tenure to implode in a single afternoon, making him the first Speaker in U.S. history to be ousted by his own party, the Trigger. A shocking alliance between Democrats and 8 ultra-conservative Republicans who decided McCarthy's greatest sin wasn't ideological betrayal, it was survival instinct. The rebellion had been simmering for weeks. Hardliners in the Freedom Caucus, led by Florida's Matt Gaetz, accused McCarthy of breaking promises by cutting a last-minute deal with Democrats to avoid a government shutdown. Their fury wasn't just about policy, it was personal. Gaetz, facing an ethics probe, seemed to relish the chance to humiliate leadership. He filed a motion to vacate the chair, a rarely used procedural grenade that forced every member to go on record, stand with McCarthy or torch him. The math was brutal. With Democrats refusing to bail out the GOP's infighting, McCarthy needed near-unanimous Republican support. He didn't come close. The vote itself was a spectacle. Lawmakers shouted over each other as Gaetz smirked from the floor. moderates pleaded for party unity while far-right members like Nancy Mace, who'd campaigned as a McCarthy ally, justified their betrayal with performative outrage. "This isn't about Kevin," claimed Arizona's Ellie Crane. "It's about holding power accountable." The irony was thick. These were the same members who demanded McCarthy weaken the Speaker's power in January, only to punish him for being too weak. When the clerk finally read the tally, 216 to 210, the chamber erupted. McCarthy's allies sat stunned, his enemies high-fived. The fallout was instantaneous. The House, already struggling to govern, descended into 3 weeks of paralysis as Republicans cycled through failed replacements. Committees froze, aid to Israel and Ukraine stalled. The GOP's internal civil war, once confined to backroom gripes, was now playing out on C-SPAN. Meanwhile, McCarthy, ever the strategist, announced he wouldn't run again for Speaker, then resigned from Congress entirely by year's end, a symbolic retreat from the chaos he'd helped unleash. What made this moment historic wasn't just the raw power grab. It was the revelation that the Speaker's gavel had become a poisoned chalice. McCarthy's ouster proved that in today's GOP, loyalty flows one way toward the extremes. The moderates who'd saved him in January abandoned him in October, fearing primary challenges from the right. And the rebels, they got exactly what they wanted: a broken Congress where dysfunction is the point. Because in the end, McCarthy's real mistake wasn't compromising with Democrats. It was thinking he could govern at all. The Senate chamber buzzed with tension on June 7, 2023, not over a high-stakes vote, but over a 10-second interaction that would ignite a firestorm of debate. Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, towering at 6'8" and clad in his signature hoodie, had just finished speaking during a heated hearing. As he stepped away from the microphone, one of his Republican colleagues, Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma, extended his hand in what should have been a routine gesture of civility. Instead, Fetterman looked down at the outstretched hand, paused, and walked away without a word. The snub was deliberate, icy, and captured on C-SPAN cameras for the nation to dissect. What made the moment so explosive wasn't just the refusal itself. It was the months of bad blood simmering between the two. Mullin, a former MMA fighter turned politician, had spent weeks taunting Fetterman online, mocking his casual Senate attire and questioning his fitness for office following the Democrats' near-fatal stroke in 2022. The jabs took on a darker tone when Mullin accused Fetterman of exaggerating his health struggles for sympathy, a claim that drew outrage from disability advocates. By the time of the handshake incident, Fetterman's patience had clearly run out. His silent rebuke spoke volumes. Some breaches of decorum, he seemed to say, don't deserve the pretense of politeness. The fallout played out along predictable partisan lines. Conservatives framed Fetterman as petulant and unprofessional, while progressives cheered his refusal to perform niceness for someone who disparaged his disability. Pundits debated whether the snub marked a breakdown in Senate norms or a long-overdue rejection of hollow gestures. But beneath the surface, the moment revealed a deeper shift in political theater. Gone were the days when lawmakers saved their animosity for backroom whispers. In an era of viral confrontations and performative hostility, even a handshake had become a political statement. Fetterman later shrugged off the controversy with characteristic bluntness. If someone kicks you in the ribs all year, you don't high-five them after. The remark distilled the incident to its core, a reminder that civility is a two-way street, and sometimes the most powerful message is the one you don't say aloud. In a chamber where tradition often masks dysfunction, Fetterman's silent walkaway didn't just break protocol. It exposed the raw nerves beneath politics as usual, proving that even the smallest gestures can carry the weight of a reckoning. From fistfights on the House floor to secret Pentagon Papers, from rubber chickens to Russian trolls hijacking government websites, the history of Congress isn't just a timeline of laws and debates. It's a chaotic, often absurd, and sometimes terrifying theater of democracy in action. These moments weren't just spectacles, they were pressure points where power, principle, and human frailty collided, leaving cracks and sometimes craters in the system. Think about it, a senator beating his colleague nearly to death over slavery. A president's desperate, "I am not a crook" denial before resigning in disgrace. A Supreme Court nominee's furious rebuttal to assault allegations, live on national TV. These weren't just scandals, they were turning points. They exposed vulnerabilities, tested institutions, and forced the country to confront hard truths about who wields power and how. But here's the thing, Congress's wildest moments also reveal democracy's stubborn resilience. When McCarthy's Red Scare turned into a televised reckoning, when Anita Hill's testimony sparked a movement despite her silencing, even when rioters stormed the Capitol only to see certification resume hours later. Each crisis proved the system could bend without breaking. Sometimes barely, and let's not forget the dark comedy. The senator reading green eggs and ham to stall a vote, the lawmaker who smuggled an alligator into the chamber. The space laser conspiracies, these aren't just bizarre footnotes, they're reminders that politics at its core is a human endeavor, flawed, messy, and occasionally ridiculous. So what's the takeaway? Democracy isn't a polished machine. It's a raucous, unpredictable experiment where progress and chaos often share the same stage. These moments, whether tragic, inspiring, or downright strange, aren't just history. They're warnings, lessons, and sometimes, strangely, reasons to hope. Now it's your turn. Which moment left you stunned? The caning that helped spark the Civil War, the bloody shirts waved to shame opponents, the live broadcast of a president's impeachment. Or maybe the time Congress accidentally rickrolled the entire internet. Drop your pick in the comments, and remember, behind every headline, there's a story reminding us democracy is always a work in progress.